We are individuals made of particular genetics. We got from our parents, from our grandparents, and those go all the way back. And there's this association with your culture, where your ancestors lived, where they migrated to, what kind of foods they ate, all the way back to hunter-gatherers even. And so if we consider our genetics first, and then we consider the microbiome second, or even put them on the equal footing, the combination of the microbes that we live with and our genetics is really what's defined as the holobiome. So the holobiome is considering the entire mixture of genes that we carry with us. We carry our own genes and we carry our microbial genes. And that begins when life begins.
Welcome to Harmonic Alignment,
a podcast that explores the new frontier of energy medicine,
bridging the gap between Western medicine and quantum physics,
giving you easy and practical solutions.
Guided by
me, Dr. Larisa Sharipova,
and me, Priscilla Koblentz. Join us on a journey discovering your harmonic alignment. On today's episode 56 of Harmonic Alignment, we nerd out on gut health and the microbiome. Dr. Larisa Sharipova connects with Dr. Shayne Morris. He's a trailblazer in the world of natural health and microbiome research. He's the CEO of Systemic Formulas and Alimentum Labs. This is such an interesting and in-depth conversation. He's going to introduce you to Holobiome, which, if you're not familiar, Holobiome is the whole body microbial health. So it's basically taking everything that is gut, skin, brain, immune system and connecting it all together. He's going to break it down in some really practical ways for you to look at how the gut health, the microbes, the keystone species in your gut affect everything from your fertility to your cognitive to your nervous system. We all know gut health is important, and Dr. Morris is really leading the way in the science to make a tailored individual approach for your health. Dr. Larisa has been working with him, and she helps do his testing. She also does his supplements. This is a really fascinating question. I think we all need to know more about the gut-brain connection and the whole biome. So enjoy this episode of Harmonic Alignment, like and share it with your friends.
Welcome to Harmonic Alignment Podcast. Today, I have a privilege and pleasure to have a conversation with Dr. Shayne Morris, who is a scientist and trailblazer in the world of natural health and microbiome research. Thank you for joining me, Dr. Shayne.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's a privilege.
In the past decades, enormous amount of research is done in the area of microbiome and gut health. The industry had explored with many different microbiome testing and supplements. By now, most people know what is microbiome, but not many familiar with holobiome terminology. And that is topic of our conversation today. I know you have your grandfather who started the company who you own now. So give us a little bit of history.
So yes, it goes back quite a few decades. In fact, around 4 decades ago was essentially when I got into it. And of course, my grandfather goes back even further, would be probably around 6 or 7 decades at this point. But my introduction to it was, of course, through not only the work my grandpa was doing, but also as I entered into the schooling, academia and advanced graduate work, it became really apparent to me that there was so much power in natural products, including microbes. And we were underserving ourselves by not understanding from the plants, from the fungi like mushrooms and the microbes, of course. Back then, there was a lot of things going on in the fermentation world, drug discovery in plants. Many of the pharmaceuticals that are currently dispensed today had their origins in natural products, from coral reefs all the way to large pine trees. So for me, it was fascinating to see how powerful they were and how effective they were. And it's probably silly to say that out loud when you think of traditional medicinal people, whether they be in Asia, India, or China, or even North American Native Americans, of course they understood that, right? Many peoples understood the power of natural products. But I wanted to bridge the gap early on between how we understood them from a medicinal standpoint and the science behind it. How could we verify or validate these things? So that's how I got introduced more into the clinical sciences as well as the natural products. I had my family on the one side living the natural products world, but then I had the science on the other side trying to understand it better and explain it better and really understand why these things work and how. That was my passion and my journey into this. And it was really this idea that this collaboration that we do, that our body does between the herbs we eat or the fungi we eat or the microbes we live with, otherwise known as the microbiome, the impact has created this profound effect on this idea of healthy living, clinical outcomes. We now can look at this through the new lens of this interaction. We used to try to use a reductionist idea that, oh, if this molecule is good for something, let's pick on the example of GLP-1. If GLP-1 agonists are good for weight loss, then let's just do that without any consequence of the greater system. And natural products bring to light this greater system that we need to be considerate of, not just a single molecule and what it does. Because there's a lot of molecules produced by, let's take the fungi or psilocybin. We know what psilocybin does, right? These hallucinogenic effects in our brain, and it comes from a fungus. So there's these really amazing things, but how do they work towards the betterment of the whole body, towards this healing and adaptations to have us live a healthy, thriving life? And it is a bigger picture and it's more complicated, but we can simplify it in ways where we think, okay, we are individuals made of particular genetics. We got from our parents, from our grandparents, and those go all the way back. And there's this association with your culture, where your ancestors lived, where they migrated to, what kind of foods they ate, all the way back to hunter-gatherers even. And so if we consider our genetics first, and then we consider the microbiome second, or even put them on the equal footing, the combination of the microbes that we live with and our genetics is really what's defined as the holobiome. So the holobiome is considering the entire mixture of genes that we carry with us. We carry our own genes and we carry our microbial genes. And that begins when life begins, right? So moms give not only half of their genetics, dads give the other half to a baby, but moms also give the initial microbiome. And then moms feed that microbiome through breast milk. So there's this beautiful dynamic that we've essentially ignored up until, like you say, this idea that people are starting to understand the microbiome. Now we want them to understand the holobiome, because your microbes are not only part of what you enter the world with, the first things you feed are both the human and the microbes with breast milk. It's designed to do both. And I think people don't appreciate that idea that we have to love and nurture our microbiome as much as we do ourselves, right? We have to love and nurture ourselves, but we also have to love and nurture the microbiome, which our moms gave to us. And the first feeding was through mom. So it is every bit as important to our health journey.
So define then microbiome and holobiome. What's the difference?
We want to think of our microbes as part of us as an organ. So the microbes that live in our gut, live in our urogenital tract, live on our skin, live in our nose, our mouth, our eyes, all throughout us, right? There's these microbes that we've associated ourselves with for our health, for our benefit. And if they're the wrong microbes, then they lead to problems, certainly culminating in certain diseases, without a doubt, right? We know that they're there to train our immune system, to manage our health, to manage our metabolism, our hormones. They're an intimate part of who we are. Collectively, those microbes are called the microbiome. Now, the microbiome defines the genetics of our microbes. Oftentimes, you'll hear the term microbiota, and that term is used to just describe the organisms, right? The fungi, the bacteria, the viruses. They're called the microbiome, biota collectively, but all of their genes that they give us and lend to us are called the microbiome. So our genome combined with the microbial genome together working as a cohesive organism is called the holobiome. So it includes the genes from the microbes and the genes from the human. And they do work together very intimately. In fact, some of the differences like between you and I, if we were to do our genetic profile, and then we were also to run our microbial profile, our microbiome profile, we would learn that there's a lot of organisms that we share, these fundamental organisms.
As a human.
Yeah. As humans, yeah. There's these fundamental organisms we share as humans, and we're different from, cattle or lions or, mice or what have you. But there's these unique organisms that have been passed down or based on our lifestyle choices, whether they're good or bad. It depends on those choices, depends on the foods we eat, the drugs we're exposed to, the stresses that we were exposed to from a young age to an old age. And that kind of gives us this unique profile. But ultimately, the genetics of each of those organisms, us and the microbes, allow us to do so much more work. I know this is a complicated topic, but a human has anywhere from, let's say, 23,000 to 26,000 genes. That's what makes us up. So genetically, we're not very complicated. We're complicated in many ways, but our genes are kind of in the middle of complications. There are a lot more organisms on the planet that are more complicated than us. However, when you look at the microbiome, a healthy microbiome that we have incorporated into our holobiome, that can contribute another 2 million genes to the way we live on this planet. 2 million genes to help us digest different foods, to help us fight off other pathogens, to help us find our mates, to help us create healthier babies, to help us have cognitive increases, right? To help us solve problems and have our brain expand and have our neurological system and our immune system constantly learning and learning and learning. We can contribute a lot of that to the microbial genes as well as the human genes. So we get this huge impact of our microbial genes to help us do more than what we could do just as humans. And that's the fun part. That's the exciting part.
So it's our genes plus microbial genes. That's what the holobiome.
That's the holobiome. Yep. In a nutshell, it's our genes plus our microbial genes that we call the holobiome.
So do they interact together? Do they change our gene expression? No.
So that's a great question. And oftentimes people don't want to think about this, or they'd love to think about this and haven't. They absolutely do. So many of our genes, like in our immune system or in our hormonal or endocrine system, interact with the microbes. So genetically, we have various genes that attract certain microbiomes, attract certain immune responses based on our microbiome. So they like attract new organisms. And that begins early on. So when moms are feeding babies breast milk, they are feeding particular bugs that they want to attract into the body. And they're also limiting the attraction of pathogens. So that your genetics dictate from the time, again, you're born, what microbes that you're trying to attract to live in and on you. When you think of this interplay between the microbial genes and the human genes dictate a healthy microbiome unless something's broken, and the microbial genes dictate a healthy human unless something's broken. And so, yes, these genes interact. One of the fun ways to think of it is we've all heard this term epigenetics. And epigenetics is a science of turning genes on and off, right? It means above the genome. So your genes are static. What you were given from your parents are the blueprint of who you are. However, what makes us all uniquely different is how we turn these genes on and off. And that can be as simple as your height, your finger length, your hair color, your eye color. These are the genes in each person turning on and off. So if you're turning blue eyes on, you're getting blue eyes. If it's brown, you're getting brown, and so on. What's even more phenomenal is this idea that the microbes in your gut are also turning genes on and off through their metabolic processes. So when you eat certain foods, they create certain compounds that become epigenetic, means that microbes can turn genes on and off. And where we see that most often, at least now, is microbes are capable of turning immune genes on and off with our T1 and T2 regulatory cells. So the right microbiome is going to be turning on genes that allow these organisms to thrive in our immune system, whereas a pathogen is going to trigger a response from your immune system. If you have a dysbiosis, you're going to be in a constant state of inflammation because of some of these epigenetic profiles. They also can control certain production of what we call neurotransmitters or neurochemicals by interacting with our genes directly. So in an epigenetic phenomenon. And so it is absolutely true that our genes interact with our microbes' genes, and they do it in a number of ways. They can produce molecules like acetylation molecules that acetylate our genes. They can produce extracellular vesicles, which are these little tiny packets of information that the microbes send into your bloodstream that then make it to the liver and turn genes on in the liver. They can turn genes on in the spleen. They can turn genes on in the lungs. So there's all these ways in which they interact, and we're just beginning to uncover what we call these mechanisms. But what we know now, looking at these more and more deeply and looking at the types of things that control this, it's become, from my perspective, so much more powerful to think of how we want to interact with vitamins, minerals, natural products, herbs, probiotics, prebiotics, how we want to interact with them, because we now see how much more impactful they are on our health. And if you don't have these, how much more difficult it is to regain things we've lost over the last 5 decades.
Wow, it's a lot of information, and for some people it's a new information, because most when we talk about microbiome, it's like gut health, right? You said it can be broken. Their influence of our genes, or our genes can influence their genes. So what can be in misalignment?
Let's take an example of, if you have gone through cycles of, let's say, antibiotic use, and you've destroyed these microbes, and that's happened, right? We're seeing what we call extinction events, no different than when we cut down a forest in a rainforest, and what grows back is a single plant, whereas before we had thousands of plants. When you actually go through and take a round of antibiotics, and then you have to do it again because you're not thinking about your microbiome, you're trying to kill an organism, but in the process you kill important organisms. And we've been doing that for decades now. Well, now that we have these extinction events, we're finding that we've broken what we consider a healthy microbiome. We've broken the diversity, we've broken the ability to produce certain compounds. And even when people reintroduce foods, so we all know that we need to be eating better, right? That's probably no longer a question in people's mind. We know that we want to start using more whole foods, clean foods. There's all these things that seem to be somewhat obvious. However, when we take people that have struggled and have a broken microbiome, which immediately means they have a broken immune system, by the way. When you have a broken microbiome, your immune system is absolutely broken. That's clear. You might even have other things broken, like the gut-brain axis or the gut-liver axis. Well, when we start feeding them whole foods, we find that many of them have miserable consequences. You know, they're bloating, they're cramping, and then it all becomes about the gut. You know, when you have a broken microbiome, you start having food sensitivities. You might be in the FODMAPs range, or you find better if you just eat protein and fat, right? Because you're not challenging the microbiome. And so in order to get back to a place where you need to go, we have to both introduce new microbes into the microbiome, we create that diversity. And again, if we think of it as like a coral reef, we have to reintroduce these key species so that these key species can start to live in there where they once were. And then when we introduce these whole foods, these key species are able to use these whole foods and not turn them into gases and bloating and methane and hydrogen sulfide and all these unwanted side effects. So when it breaks, it gives us symptoms. You made a really good point earlier where you said we often think of the microbiome as simply gut-related issues. And clearly it is related to gut problems. An unhealthy microbiome leads to an unhealthy gut in many ways, right? It can go from simple food sensitivities and limited diets to IBS, IBD, Crohn's. It can lead to much more extreme examples starting from an unhealthy gut. However, when you think of much greater bodily processes like interconnectivity between the gut, the brain, the liver, the lung, an unhealthy microbiome can lead to a non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is also going to impact the fatty pancreatic disease. They're both hand in hand, even though most people don't look for that. But when your liver is unhealthy and it's developing the fatty liver, so is the pancreas. And most people miss that actual clinical evaluation. The other things that can happen are things that we relate to the brain, from cognitive decline or anxiety, or even to the level of when you think of like autism or dementia or Alzheimer's. One of the first telltale signs of that is this desire for those people, whether it be on the autism spectrum or in Alzheimer's and dementias, they all of a sudden become very narrow in their food choices because their gut is not happy when they expand their food choices. So if you think about it, when you meet these kids or you meet older people that are struggling with these complications in their cognitive function, they tend to have very, very simple diets. And so early on, we think of, this issue leads to a simple diet. And really what it is the impact between the gut-brain axis. The microbes have been simplified so much. We need to work on developing their microbiome while we work on developing their brain. We're doing it together. And that kind of relates back to the holobiome. If we work on the microbes and the brain, we're going to have a successful outcome. If we just work on one or the other, we're going to be jumping back and forth and missing their absolute outcome that we want to achieve. So we work on them together.
And speaking about working together, so it's not only you work on a brain, on microbiome, but also if you want to introduce new food to have a variety of food, you need to make sure that you have a microbes that can consume that food. So
yes.
You start working on adding more bacteria, or would you do testing first and see what's pathological, what's normal?
So there's two kinds of testing that are relatively accessible. So we know there are people out there offering DNA tests. We know there are people offering microbiome tests. And we are like them, right? Where we already have a DNA test, my DNA. But one of the challenges is we want to look for actionable genes. There's so many genes in our body, right? We have 3 billion base pairs of DNA per cell. And there are essentially, a couple of thousand genes that are related to our nutritional profiling and our health outcomes. Now, there are many that are related specifically to diseases. For example, anybody that's had a baby, the little toe gets pricked for PKU, phenylketonuria. That's a mutation that if a baby is born with it, it must avoid phenylalanine because that's a toxin to that baby because of their genetic profile, their genetic SNP. We've moved away from those disease ones, and we focus on nutritional polymorphisms. So we look across millions of genes and say, okay, let's identify the ones that can impact vitamin uptake, vitamin utilization, mineral uptake, mineral utilization, other compounds like fish oils, other omegas. We can look at amino acid profiles. We can look at unique compounds like lycopene or astaxanthin or these really cool plant compounds, and how our genetics is either being improved upon by these compounds, or do we already have the mechanisms to handle it? And really what you're looking for is shortcomings. So we all are aware of the methylation gene, as I mentioned. And if you have these SNPs, then of course you're going to want to focus on bringing in methylation type nutrients, right? The methylcobalamins, the methyl tetrahydrofolates, the B6, the zinc, magnesium, etc. We want to support what we consider a genetic predisposition or weakness. And that can be done across many of these things, right? Your body can make DHA and EPA, which are the omega-3s. However, some genetics in some people limit your ability to do that. So if that's the case, using these tests, you can say, well, it looks like your genetics limits you to how much you can make. So let's make sure you get EPA and DHA in your body through supplements and food, because you don't make it as efficiently as, let's say, your sibling or your parent or something. So these are the ways in which we can utilize DNA to tailor a very unique or a personalized approach to nutrition, herbs, etc. Now, we can do the same thing with microbes. We can look at what a microbiome looks like in the gut. And from that, there's a lot of interpretation. Human genetics is, in fact, ahead of microbiome research because it's been around longer. So we know more about these genes and what they can do and how we can benefit them. The microbial world, it's moving quickly and it's coming up, but we're in the beta phase of our microbiome test. And we look at across the entire map of microbes, we sequence all of them. It's called next-gen sequencing or full sequencing. And we look for all kinds of organisms, the ones that should be there, the ones that shouldn't be there. We can capture fungus and parasites and viruses. And from that, you understand, just from what we know, we have a collection of organisms that should be there based on other studies that we've been doing over the years. And of course, academia has contributed to that immensely. A lot of labs around the world have done this work. And we can see what kind of diversity we should have. Do we want it to look like a beautiful coral reef, or do we want it to look like a half-dead coral reef? We want the beautiful version. So we look at that. We look at the diversity, what kind of metabolites they can produce, then look at the ways in which we can improve that diversity. And one of the ways that works really well right now is when we apply probiotics to the scene, along with the prebiotics to feed them. And prebiotics are diverse, and we'll get back to that. But from the testing of the microbiome, we can then analyze how healthy it looks, what players are present, how we want to change the microbiome. And then by applying things like soil-based organisms, what we consider more the lactobacillus bifidos, which are very helpful and clinically relevant, but they don't live in us, but they do make the environment more inhabitable. And then, of course, what we have access to that almost no one else does is we have what we call keystone organisms. These are organisms that we want to get back into the population of people's microbiomes. They're not made from ferments. They're not made from any of the kombuchas, kefirs, yogurts, any of that. You can't find them in nature. They come from humans. They originally came from mom, but now they're absent through all the things we talked about: toxin exposure, antibiotic use, where you've been living, how you've been brought up, et cetera. We want to reintroduce these keystone species. And what keystone species means is they're an important aspect of the community. So they may not be the most abundant, right? You might have one little fish in a coral reef that provides all of the corals some nutrients. So the corals flourish because of that one fish. Keystone species in your gut can provide nutrients to a lot of other microbes to allow that whole ecosystem to thrive. So we want to reintroduce these keystone species, and then we want to feed them. And if you do that in a way where you get the species growing and the food coming in, you find that you're now reversing a lot of this damage that's been done to the gut. And that is really the future of what we're doing. So you tie them together. You have the testing of the human genes. You have the microbiome testing to give us a baseline. What status are you in? And then we start introducing the tools to essentially improve upon your genetics nutritionally and redevelop a microbiome that's healthy. And you'll even see the impact on blood labs. So for people that run blood labs, as you focus on these two pieces, you can improve blood lab outcomes pretty quickly as you're doing these steps. And that's where the testing is really useful. I wish I had my microbiome testing done now. We just finished what we call an observational study. So we had 30 people enrolled, and we've been following them through and making sure that we're seeing what their baseline was and how we're improving it. And it's pretty exciting data. And we've got, you can look at the different individuals, and one individual, just their gut was a wreck. And as we slowly introduce these changes, we've already seen the improvements from a testing standpoint. And then, of course, you have them fill out questionnaires, and their symptoms are improving. So we're getting improvements by taking this approach. And again, it's very personal, which is why our probiotics are very personal. To make it less confusing, we're working on the reports to be completely transparent. It's a lot of data, and our first reports are somewhat overwhelming, so we're simplifying them for people. So the next version will be simpler. The other thing that we're going to keep educating on is this idea that keystone organisms, all of them become important. So we've broken them down into immune, neurological, hormonal, et cetera. But in the scheme of building back that entire diversity, we want everybody to go through each and every round. So if you start off with neurocognitive issues and that's your focus, yes, you begin there, or you begin in what we call roadmap, but ultimately we want you to go through every single probiotic and prebiotic because they all play a role, even if you don't know it. So even the skin microbiome is based on gut health, right? The skin gut axis. So we just want everybody to go through all of them over their course of their treatments because that's where the benefit comes out. Not just one of the probiotics and one of the pre's, but ultimately all three or all 9 of them. And in the end, yeah.
Question about keystones. I know the most popular now is Akkermansia, right?
Yeah.
And are they a permanent species or they are transitory like lactobacillus and bifidum? They stay in the gut if you feed them or they still have a lifetime and they live anyway?
Keystone species, by definition, is a species that lives symbiotically in us and needs to live in us. So from that perspective, we want to make sure that we understand that there are many lactose and many bifidos that are transient. And to be clear, there's these really cool organisms we call soil-based or spore-forming. And then they come from the soil, obviously, and we see them in like Terra. These are also transient, but they do give us a benefit. But they differ widely from keystone organisms that are meant to live in us for our lifetime. They go up and down. You would expect to see some of these species going up and down depend on your diet. Certain seasons, like in the winter, you expect more Akkermansia, whereas in other seasons, you might have more Christenselia or Doria and these other keystone species. They fluctuate based on your diet and what you have access to. Prior to having access to everything, everywhere, like in the United States, we can get citrus fruits anytime, we can get meat anytime, right? We have too much access almost. Our ancestors went through seasons. And so these organisms would rise and fall. Studies on the hunter-gatherer or the Amerindians, their guts do rise and fall in their types of organisms, types of keystone. They don't have any extinctions, but they do see growth and then declines throughout the seasons. And that's important because each of these organisms helps you metabolize different foods at different times. And we want to encourage that behavior. So for people that have an ancestral background, they can eat towards that ancestral background. And it is typically more beneficial to their microbiome and to their genetics because that's where they came from and that's where they're going. So these keystone species are symbiotic inhabitants of our gut and they don't leave. When they do leave, that's a problem. The transient organisms are in, they do their work, but then they do leave. And there are some, not to be too confusing, but most of the lactobacillus and bifido are transient. However, there are some that are residents of our gut. There are certain lactose and certain bifidos that are residents that live with us forever. In women in particular, there's 5 types of urogenital profiles, and 3 or 4 of those are lactobacillus dominant. So a healthy urogenital in women, many of those classes are very much lactobacillus dominant. So these are not transient. These are symbionts, commensal symbionts that need to live in the urogenital tract. Now they fluctuate over the lifespan of a woman. They're different in pre-pubescent, but then throughout the childbirthing years, they're different. And then post-menopause, they change. But overall, we want to keep those things healthy and they are lacto. So there's places where lacto is a commensal living with us, but then a lot of the probiotics on the market are just transient. They come from the fermentation world. We focus mostly on the organisms that live in us. We focus very rarely on these transients. There are a few exceptions like the SBOs, the soil-based organisms. Those are transient, but we know what they do and we love them anyway, right? We love that they're transient.
They also support you for key species?
They do, in fact, yeah. Some of these transient species, and if you just think of fermented foods, soil-based organisms, they actually give us a lot of benefit. And we don't know exactly how they do it in many ways, but one thing they do is they seem to support the organisms that are meant to live in you and reside in that ecosystem. They actually support their health. So over the millennia that we've used fermented foods, there is an amazing benefit fermented foods. And they allow us to adapt more quickly to a new diet. They allow us to incorporate more prebiotics into our diet if we include fermented foods in that process. They tend to allow us to do a much more rapid achievement of a better gut health when you include those into the prebiotics, the probiotics, and the dietary changes. So fermented foods have a really important role, even if they're all transient. Yeah, they offer up a lot of benefit through how we digest food, how they encourage the growth of new bugs. They make metabolites that are very healthy for us. So yeah, there's these amazing benefits through fermented foods, and the data shows that.
Mm-hmm. Coming back, just a comment on lactobacillus that live in a woman's body, specifically like in the vaginal canal. I don't know if we ever identify species in uterus or placenta. Do you know if there is any found there?
There is a small microbiome. The vast majority of it is in the vaginal tract.
Mm-hmm.
Even in men, there's in the prostate, you find some. So in semen, there seems to be a microbiome. So men's health is very important when it comes to fertility.
Yeah.
You know, you want to prevent issues with your urogenital tract, whether you're a male or female. And so the microbiome in the vaginal tract is really important for both fertility and for the health of that tissue. Mm-hmm. And the uterus, of course, they benefit. It's going to be very similar as you move up into these other organs. The microbiome tends to be a lot less abundant, but it still exists. And there's a healthy version and an unhealthy version. And it does make women more susceptible to issues. Fertility is one, UTIs is another, the bacterial vaginosis or yeast infections. These are all part of what we consider a dysbiosis. If that microbiome gets shifted in any way by a pathogen or disruption, then there are consequences. And we just named some of those. There's something, you've probably heard of this, called honeymooners disease, right? So when two microbiomes come into contact for the first time, it can be a little disruptive. And so
it's a war out there.
Yes. And so you need to create a compatibility, because that leads to a much more successful outcome, both, for the couple, whoever they may be, and for the health of the urogenital tract, both ways. So you need to be very aware of the male microbiome and the female microbiome, and it can't be unhealthy, because if it's unhealthy, you keep passing that back and forth, right? And through each encounter, it recovers within a few days back to the normal. But that recovery is good when both microbiomes are compatible. And fertility has shown the same thing. If you're very incompatible, oftentimes one or the other partner needs to work on their microbiome to make it more compatible. And to prevent these, breakouts of BV or any other STI that we refer to, these are all, of course, born out of the microbes. And so those microbes need to be healthy. Don't use toxic soaps. Don't try to kill the bugs. Don't do washes that are unnecessary and somewhat disruptive. Very natural in that place as well as anywhere else on our body. Be very aware of keeping that microbiome healthy. It's probably creepy for some people to hear that, but it's certainly a very important part. Perfumes and all these things that people do, not a good idea. We need to keep those areas healthy and natural.
Even being trained as OBGYN, like I know about vagina, right? And I know that it's very important. pH supposed to be acidic. That's because of the lactobacillus that keeps it acidic. And you said it's changed throughout the life, but I don't think only changed throughout the life. It's changed through the cycle. We have one pH in one phase and another pH in different phase. That's why we become more fertile in the middle, because that's the shift microbiome happening even during the 1 month, right? Not even compared to the whole your life. But I think with age, we lose not only microbiome in a gut, but we lose microbiome everywhere on the body, because it's all connected. So
You're absolutely right.
and also I remember you talk about dysbiosis like in the vagina, but dysbiosis in gut. And I remember when I was in medical school and we did microbiology and all these questions that until you heal your gut, you will never heal your vagina dysbiosis. So because it's all connected. So how they communicate between gut and all other part of the body, like skin and brain and vagina and liver and everything else.
I mean, that is really getting in deep, which is exciting. I'm glad you want to get in there. So there's a few ways in which the gut microbiome influences the vaginal microbiome, for example. One is the exit, right? So the vaginal opening and the anus opening are really close together. So you see that oftentimes and we've seen this in, like, say, probiotic usage. If you take a probiotic orally and then you look for that organism in the vaginal cavity, you can find it. So it makes its way over. That's one way. Is it just the close anatomical association? But also there's this, it's new science and we're still looking at it, is there seems to be a possibility that the immune system can grab a microbe from your gut and traffic it to the vaginal area and release it. So it's like a catch and release scenario where you can move microbes using your immune system cells from one place to another. And that seems to be a really, really fascinating, because it also seems to happen in breast tissue when you're breastfeeding, that microbes get pulled from the gut and trafficked to the breast tissue so that the baby can receive these microbes. It wasn't just simply through their vaginal birth, but later on as they're breastfeeding. Those are two ways in which we see it. Now, what dictates that, though, as you mentioned, throughout a cycle and throughout a lifespan, is the vaginal and the gut microbes are very much in tune with our hormonal cycles. And so as the microbes in the gut are seeing, let's say, for example, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, everything being dumped from the liver through the gallbladder into the waste, right? Wanting to get rid of some of these hormones when they're not on cycle. So, the estrogen went up and now it's going down and it's being pulled out of the bloodstream through the liver detoxification process. When it's dumped into the gut, it needs to be trafficked out and into the toilet. However, if you have a dysbiosis in the gut where these microbes are capable of reabsorbing, or they trigger an enzyme reaction that allows estrogen to be reabsorbed, now you're driving estrogen up when estrogen should be low, and that impacts the vaginal microbiome. Now, the vaginal microbiome doesn't go through its rhythm. It's now confused. And so even throughout a month, if the hormones aren't being balanced because you either have a gut issue or a liver issue, you're also affecting the vaginal microbiome through hormone processes, because they communicate, estrogen in particular, and the microbes in the vaginal cavity, they communicate through hormones very often. So that's why even some studies that were done a few years back where women in menopause, just by having a local estrogen tablet inserted vaginally, they saw the microbiome rebound into a healthier, younger microbiome just by having the presence of estrogen in the cavity. They saw a much healthier microbiome. And these were for, of course, postmenopausal women. So we know that there is this intimate relationship between hormones, particularly in women, and the vaginal microbiome. That's another way in which they interact. So our hormones dictate the health of our microbiome, and the microbiome dictates the health of our hormones.
Mm-hmm. And when you talk about how the microbiome communicate, is it called quorum sensing?
Yeah, so quorum sensing is a really phenomenal, it's been around a long time. Think of the idea of Marco Polo, right? You've seen that game played in the pool. You've got your blindfold on and you say Marco and someone else yells Polo and you go in that direction.
Right.
Then if they move and you yell it again and they've moved, you go in that direction. So you continually find your way to that person. So quorum sensing, microbes use these receptors in their body to identify food or other chemical sources like hormones or other messenger chemicals, and they move in the direction of that chemical. And so
like antennas, like having antennas.
Yes, like having antennas. They continually move until they get to where they are. So this quorum sensing will lead microbes to not only follow, let's say, estrogen in the vaginal tract, or in the gut, there's microbes that move in the direction away from, let's say, hydrochloric acid in the stomach. They sense hydrochloric acid, they move away. They move towards urea, and that's H. pylori. So they have this ability to move towards or away from something they want or they dislike. They can go both directions, and that's quorum sensing. They move and they grow and flourish either in the direction of nutrients or they move away from threats.
So that sounds like a quantum biology. It's like more on energetic level, right? Because there is nothing that directly pull them there. They just sensing, it means feeling, right?
Yeah, they feel it through their senses. Yeah. And then many of them have the ability to move. Right? They have little cilia or they have tails, and they can actually move quite rapidly away or to something. Now, other ones are much less mobile, so they have to move more slowly, but some are quite rapid. And you're right, they can sense their surroundings. Now, we think there's a lot more of that going on, that sense that they have, because there's so many things we don't know about how they move and colonize and how they interact with all of our genetics, for example. So that's forthcoming. We're going to keep understanding that in the future, but there's going to be many, many, many more versions of this sensing that they can do, no doubt.
So we just don't know mechanism yet, or we did not get a big enough microscope to see how it's happening.
Yeah, and to see it in place, right? To actually be able to see it real time in the gut or in the vaginal tract or wherever it may be. That'll be coming, but yeah, the understanding of how this is working, we're just in the beginning of that. Yeah.
And speaking again about hormones, and you mentioned estrogen and estrogen dominance becoming when we cannot metabolize estrogen from the body because of the liver, but also a microbiome, it's called estrobolome, that's responsible only for estrogen to be metabolized. That's what
That's right. Yeah. So that description I gave you with where we're enzymatically releasing estrogen back into the bloodstream, that is part of the estrobolome. Yeah. And that's found in the gut.
And that's only for estrogen. How about progesterone, cortisol, and all other things?
Don't know yet. And we know that estrogen for sure, but we're also seeing it happening in other areas. For example, let's take a look at toxins. So when toxins are modified by the liver and sent into the small intestine and then the colon to be released right out of the body, we're trying to excrete them. There are other enzymes made by other microbes that you don't want there. So, for example, you can re-release toxins from what was considered the exit path if you've got the wrong microbes. There's ways to re-release heavy metals, and so they can be reabsorbed, even though your body's trying to eliminate them. There's some evidence with plastics where you really want them to be pulled out of the bloodstream, sent through the liver, and then released into the colon, out of the body. But if microbes alter that process, you can reabsorb them. And so there's evidence now that an unhealthy microbiome or microbiome we don't want present because of choices we've made can really hinder our health journey, whether it be through detoxification or through nutrient uptake and release. They absolutely are altering that dynamic or that balance. So again, that's why microbes have become part of my passion in this world, because they're ever present in us. No matter whether they're good or bad, they're always there if we don't do something about it. They are contributing to our ability to detox, our ability to manufacture and keep nutrients, our ability to manage our hormones or our neurotransmitters or our immune system. They're always there. So if you have a gut that's full of bad players, bad organisms, then you literally have a manufacturing plant of bad things, meaning that you might as well be drinking bad water every day because the microbes are producing things you don't want day in, day out, unless you make that change. You can detox, you can clean up your water, you can clean up your food, but if you don't get rid of the organisms that are producing, manufacturing harmful metabolites, you're still going to be struggling. So they're key to our success is getting rid of these invisible manufacturing plants. When they're always there, they're always making things that we don't want unless you get the good guys in place.
So having perfect liver detoxification, it's not enough. We have to have a gut prepared to eliminate all that we did.
That's right. Yeah, your liver can be working overtime, but if your gut is working against it, you're essentially recycling all the toxins and your liver is going to get burned out. That's the fatty liver disease that's non-alcoholic based. That is the toxins.
Even notice when I take people on detox program, right, for 3 phases,
Yeah.
if you don't prepare gut for elimination, everything is stuck and nothing is moving,
Yes.
and symptoms and everything else. So that's
right.
how important it is to have gut heal first, prepare gut for elimination, and then you start the detoxification.
That's right. I mean, you get this immediate benefit from a detox program. People feel good early, but then as you journey down that path, they might plateau or even rebound. They're like, why don't I feel good anymore? Or why am I stuck? My metabolism slowed down, or, there's these plateaus that we must look at the gut at that point, because we've helped the liver, we've helped the pancreas, we've helped the other cellular metabolic pieces, but we haven't fixed maybe another source of toxins, which is the gut.
And now from talking to you, you know that it's not only nutrients that our bugs help us with, it's much more, and a lot of things that we still don't even know. What do you see exciting in coming years with microbiome, holobiome? What's exciting for you?
I'll be super excited to get our testing. We've got the genetic testing. We got to do the update to it. We're working on the microbiome testing, and ultimately we'll have a gut, followed by vaginal, followed by oral, and then skin. Be last. Skin tends to be really difficult, by the way. I want to have all those being built and offered to all the clinicians. And then we will have the tools to connect those holobiome journeys. And then from the other side, from a product and lifestyle side, we will be able to understand the microbiome, understand the genetics, and make recommendations that are so personal and so amazing that we're actually starting to make a difference throughout that journey for people. It isn't just one size fits all. There's a lot of overlaps. Like you and I have a lot of similar genetics, but we have these individual pieces, both microbiome and our genetics. And when we work on those for all of our practitioners, patients, I mean, we've started seeing these changes in people from working at both angles in a personalized way. So the future will allow us to become even more personal, to understand with all these tools that we're building, the underlying or the root causes. Oftentimes we get benefits from just working on the gut and the nutrients and the genetics, but there's still these cases that we struggle. There's these tough cases that they see improvement and then they stop improving, then we improve them again. But it's a yo-yo, right? It's a journey. And there's other ones where we just hit it out of the park. Fantastic. They're great. Their tests are coming back great. They're happy. They're thriving. I think the more we learn about these holobiome pieces, the more we'll be able to tackle these cases quicker and quicker and quicker as we've been doing. I think it's an important part of where we're headed. I was all excited years ago when we understood detoxification better. I was excited years ago when we understood cellular metabolism better and we could improve upon cellular pieces, and that helped our liver and our brain, et cetera. But now we have to take it a step further to continue that journey. We got to get more and more precise with more and more data and energy, right? We're all about the energy. It's important.
That's where we're going, quantum biology. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And I'm so excited about the future too. You mentioned prebiotic and probiotic. So prebiotic, it's a food for microbiome as a probiotic. The probiotic feed the bacteria to grow. So tell us where people need to go for the good, product.
So people that don't have a practitioner, we have a place on the website they can go and sign up and get associated with a practitioner, right? So for example, if you have a bunch of patients, we can assign them under you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then they have access to all the same products. Mm-hmm. That's the easiest thing for a patient, so to speak, to do.
And what if people looking somewhere else, like in the world? What is the main thing they need to know when they buy probiotic?
This idea of the microbiome has really expanded, right? I first used that term in like 2008, and like the holobiome, people scratched their head and said, what in the world is a microbiome? In 2008, it was not well understood, nor do people understand the language microbiome. Fast forward till now, it's become amazingly accepted that we want to work on our microbiome, improve it. Two of the ways in which we do that is prebiotics and probiotics. And so everybody, it seems, is offering a pre and a pro, a prebiotic and a probiotic. So what all the people that want to know more about this need to do is, one, not many people offer keystone probiotics. They're important. Not many people offer probiotics that have been studied in humans. So a lot of the probiotics available on the market, Lactobacillus, Bifido, and some others, they're again transient, right? They've derived from the dairy industry or the cheese or the other fermentation industry. They have benefits, but they're not true commensal organisms. They're just transient. So looking at the bottle, there should be some reference to something you can look up. So if you take a Lactobacillus acidophilus, there should be some way for someone to say, well, is this an important one or is this just a normal fermented one? That's important to start to learn more about what's on the label, what it contains. If not, reach out to the company. We encourage people to reach out to us and say, hey, I've looked at these 4 probiotics. Can you tell me about this? Yes, we can. These are basic. These are more important to our journey. And secondly is the idea of prebiotics. So prebiotics by definition are a food, and they're based on certain foods. So all of ours are a complex of fibers, both soluble, non-soluble. There's things like other plant compounds, the polyphenolics, the flavonoids, the other colorful compounds that we see in plants. And these are all kind of collectively good for the microbiome. And they need to be dosed at a higher gram level. So if someone says, oh, I have a probiotic that also contains a prebiotic in a capsule, prebiotics cannot work at that small level. Prebiotics need to be gram servings. So 5 grams, 6 grams, 7 grams. In order to achieve a feeding possibility, they can't be just a single capsule. I know a lot of people try to sell a product that is both a pre and a pro in a capsule. That isn't a legitimate way to feed microorganisms. You need a lot more of it to really achieve a prebiotic effect. So don't fall for the, ooh, I get everything in one little pill. It's not possible when it comes to prebiotics. Yeah.
When you put both together, you don't get any, right?
No. Yeah, you're not feeding them. And there are other nuances like our organisms have. We protect them from acids, right, with the capsules. We've cultivated them to make the transit. We have other things that protect them from water and oxygen, which is an important component. So there's a lot of little details that kind of get boring for most people, but certainly first and foremost, I would say is do a little research on the company when you're buying stuff. Because pres and pros are expensive.
Also say diversity, right? We all talk about diversity.
Yes.
Keystone species important, diversity in the product.
Yeah.
Also, when you talk about prebiotics, it's like why we say eat rainbow diet. So that's what you try to create, right? Put rainbow diet in the probiotic to feed those that we care about.
I mean, you're spot on. That's an amazing insight that I think I've spoken to it a little bit, but it's important to realize that a lot of people say, well, I want to take one probiotic, one organism for a month. And there are some clinically useful applications of a single organism. And then they say, well, there's no studies on complexities. Well, there are now. They're getting more and more. So we use a more complex approach because by having multiple organisms, you're allowing more organism in every day as you take a probiotic. A single organism could be beneficial, but having multiple organisms really does create more of a diversity. And we've seen that, and we've got data on that. But the impact is subtle unless you're doing the other things like the prebiotics. I can give you an organism or a group of organisms every day. You'll get a benefit, but if you stop taking it, that benefit starts to diminish. So we need to feed these organisms. And where the data is clear, you may have heard other people speak of this monoculturing, where if you take one thing too much, you're going to create too much of that. And that doesn't seem to be true for probiotics. Even if you take the same one every day, they don't colonize because there's a competition in our gut. So, the other guys are going to keep everything under a healthy competition.
And because they're transient, they're going to leave.
Because they're transient. Yeah, they're going to go through and leave. The other side of that coin, though, is if you mono supplement either your diet or your prebiotic. So if you take nothing but inulin every day, there is now evidence that you're going to start growing more of the organisms that can use inulin, and you're going to lose the growth of organisms that need polyphenolics, that need galacto-oligosaccharides, that need xylo-oligosaccharides. They need all of these other types of fiber and plant compounds that inulin doesn't provide. So you are going to start to shift your microbiome. That actually is one of the outcomes. So I tell people, when you're moving down this path of creating diversity, taking our probiotics and our prebiotics, one of the things I like them to introduce first is the Terra, because it contains both the SBOs, but it also has the fermented foods. It has some kefir and kombucha in there, not the milk or the liquid, so it's not allergenic. That helps us create this diversity. And if they can't tolerate, or if they want to add to that, you can add fermented foods along with your pres and pros, and that does create a greater benefit over that time frame. It seems to be very much symbiotic in nature. Now, not everything tastes good, so you kind of have to find and pick your preferences, because, kimchi doesn't apply to everybody's taste buds. But there's benefit along that route for all these pre and pro applications. And then you can introduce more diet.
Yeah, our time coming to the end. So any last words? I know you work towards practitioners. How practitioners find you and what you offer?
Yes. So you can go to the website, which is systemicformulas.com. In the next month or two, it'll be both systemicformulas.com and alimentumlabs.com. They're being combined. We're going to do some upgrades there, so that'll be amazing. You can go in and sign up for an account there. If you're a patient, you can go in and sign up and get a practitioner. Definitely follow us on Instagram, either Systemic or Alimentum Labs. I do have another one that's Dr. Shayne, where I can talk more openly about research and clinical things, because it's me personally chatting up. I like input, feedback, topics. There's a lot of fun topics that we need to cover. We love to teach, and we love to keep it, transparent.
All right. Thank you, Shayne. Dr. Shayne Morris, thank you for your wisdom, for all your knowledge. You're always fun to talk to, and all scientific wisdom that you gave us.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm grateful. This was fun.
Thank you.
Are you ready for your Energy for Life bioenergetic nest scan? Dr. Larisa Sharapova and myself, Priscilla Koblenz, offer personal, private, 90-minute consults to get you back to optimal health and well-being. For more details, visit the show notes or check out harmonicalignment.co. We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Harmonic Alignment. If something resonated with you, we would love to hear about it. Please consider leaving us a 5-star review and subscribing so you don't miss an upcoming episode. Thank you. The information contained in this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and not intended for the purpose of diagnosing, treating, curing, or preventing any disease. Before using any products referenced on the podcast, consult with your healthcare provider. Carefully read all labels and directions. The products and information received through the podcast should not be used to replace a consultation or advice from your healthcare provider. If you suspect you have a medical problem or have any healthcare questions, please promptly call your healthcare provider. This podcast, including Dr. Larisa Sharapova and Priscilla Koblenz, and the producers are not responsible for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained in this podcast. This podcast may contain endorsements and advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct financial benefit to the product or services referenced.